You're now listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.
Hello, Rockies. This is Sarah Jane Maroney, your host, and welcome to our Engage the Rockies interview with David Bobb. For more than 20 years, he has been one of the leading advocates for strong civics and history education in the United States. David serves as president and CEO of the Bill of Rights Institute, a position he's held since 2013. David serves on the advisory board for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's National Civics Bee and on the steering committee for Educating for Democracy, a cross-ideological roadmap for civic learning and engagement. He's the author of Humility, an unlikely biography of America's greatest virtue, and a chapter on Frederick Douglass in a 2019 volume published by Oxford University Press. David has written for the Wall Street Journal and Education Week, among numerous other publications. He earned his undergraduate degree from Hillsdale College and has a PhD in political science from Boston College. David and his wife Anna have 2 sons and reside in Arlington, Virginia. We welcome him. David, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you.
So, tell us a little bit about how we got here in terms of your role at the Bill of Rights Institute.
I joined the Bill of Rights Institute little over 11 years ago. I had spent time in higher education, teaching at Hillsdale College, earning a PhD in political science from Boston College. I came to Civics and the Bill of Rights Institute because I saw what was happening in college students. For example, in one class, when I was teaching as a grad student, I quoted from the Declaration of Independence, and not one student in the class did it really register with them what I was quoting from. It's easy to kind of think of teenagers, young people, as the reason that we're in a big problem when it comes to history and civics knowledge and engagement. I don't blame them at all, though. And I didn't blame my students. I never have. And it's one of the reasons that I love working at the Bill of Rights Institute is that we're looking for solutions. Young people actually want to learn this stuff. They want to have it built into their schools. They want to have it built into their out-of-school activity. And that's why I love working at an organization that teaches history and civics.
Wonderful. That's amazing. And so tell me a little bit about what the Bill of Rights Institute does.
So very simply, we teach history and civics. And the goal is really that how do you make this thing personal, not abstract? Civics as a brand conjures up, sadly, most often the word boring. It seems like a bunch of charts and graphs, right? Concepts like separation of powers or checks and balances, and people hearken back to that class that maybe didn't engage them as much as it could. When you think of it as something that is personal, what you're really talking about is a kind of mentality, almost a way of being. Being an American requires knowledge. It requires the building of skills, and ultimately it issues in a disposition that says, I'm grateful. I'm proud to be an American because of what we see at the Bill of Rights Institute and what Frederick Douglass called the saving principles: freedom and equality for all. When you as an individual, and we work mainly with young Americans, when you come to that knowledge early on in your life, you can't help but think, this is something I want to share. This is something that I want to extend my gratitude by acting on these ideas. And that action, that activity is so important. It's a vital part of civics. It's a vital part of what we do. So if you think really simply, what is civics? You might think of it as the kind of practice of the pursuit of happiness. Take your departure from the Declaration of Independence, the principles that are in it, and think, how can you apply this in your own life? And how can you equip others to be headed in the same direction? And that collective thing that we do is citizenship.
So this might seem a bit of an obvious question, but why would we need you to teach when there are plenty of state schools? Not that I'm insinuating they're doing the best job or even the worst job, but why would we need another organization?
So a nonprofit like the Bill of Rights Institute really helps teachers. Most of those teachers teach in our district school system. And I'll suggest that nearly all of them are more entrepreneurial than the systems they're in. And they'd say the same thing. They'd say that they have some challenges in their learning environments. Oftentimes they're too bureaucratic. For example, the textbook that a teacher is handed, that's often negotiated by somebody who's not actually in the classroom. Texans, for example, I know you're based in Colorado. I don't know the figures for your state off the top of my head, but Texans spend $400 million a year on textbooks alone. Now, when you ask the people who are working in the administration of a school district, how much time do your teachers spend in the textbook? They'll answer, it's really 1 out of 2 days. Ask the teachers the same question, and the teachers say it's 1 out of 5 days. That's a big gap. Bill of Rights Institute is there for the 4 out of 5 days when the teacher isn't using the textbook. We used to be known as kind of a publisher of supplementary materials. You'd hear that term. But now, through a library of 6,000 resources, BRI can be your one-stop shop. And for a lot of teachers, we are. We talked a little bit about the history and why I'm at the Bill of Rights Institute, but our overall work is now with 83,000 educators across all 50 states in the District of Columbia. 1,800 of those, a little more than 1,800 of those teach in the state of Colorado. And so the goal is for us to come alongside teachers, whether they're working in a district school, a charter school. You have so many great charter schools in your state, many of which we've been pleased to work with and support. Whether you're in a private religious school, whether you're in an independent school, a micro school, a home school, BRI materials are free to the end user. They're made possible by philanthropic support. And that means that we're able to really give teachers the kind of learning and engagement materials that they need. You can go to mybri.org, find anything you want on every topic related to history and civics. Of course, we cover the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, but every era of history also. These are materials that can be used in a college board, advanced placement class, for non-AP classes, for a one-on-one tutoring session. Just as easily as you build a playlist of songs on Spotify, you can build a playlist of learning resources at the Bill of Rights Institute website.
Amazing. That's brilliant. And so that would help homeschoolers as well as any district schools or charter schools. It doesn't really matter.
We support and love homeschoolers. You know, I think that for the last 25 years of my professional career, I've been very much involved in the classical school movement and building that. I think the fundamental point of departure that we take in our educational philosophy at the Bill of Rights Institute is that parents are the first educators. We're not a policy shop, so we're not engaged in the day-to-day challenges over funding mechanisms. How should schools be funding? But we are a supporter of an kind of all of the above strategy, you know, that parents should have the power to send their kids to the school of their choosing. And they're going to be involved in their kids' lives. Now, the funny thing about civics and history that we've seen lately is in district schools, a lot of times an elementary school teacher in a public district school will have 20 minutes per week to teach history and or civics. Per week, 20 minutes is not going to cut it. Now, a lot of charter schools are going to spend an hour at least 3 times a week, and many of them have 5 days a week instruction. Why? Because you want to get to history. You want to talk about the character of each individual child and help them polish their soul, help them become the human being, the person that they're capable of being. You want to anchor them on civil society. The domains of business and philanthropy are often neglected in civic learning and the kind of mainstream curriculum that's offered in these taxpayer-funded textbooks. And then only after you do those things, history, character, civil society, do you come around to the thing that a lot of people think civics is only about, and that's government. Government is constitutionally limited. It's not the first thing that we actually go to when we want to effect change in society. And that's one of the biggest things that we're trying to turn around when it comes to kind of social studies writ large, a term that's used by a lot of people to encompass history and civics. What young people oftentimes today get a sense of is that if they can just go to Washington, D.C., or if they can just go to their state capital, they are going to be able to become change makers. And what we're trying to say is the best way for you to actually make the change that's going to last and endure and be valuable is to learn the principles of the American founding. Think, what's that logic at work in the Declaration of Independence? What's the kind of constitutional structure? And then think about how you can take those principles and apply them to today's challenges, but do so in your local community. When you localize these efforts, what tends to happen is that young people try Let's say they want to change something in their local community, like they don't have a farmer's market, they want to start it. That's a doable task. It's hard actually for a 15 or 16-year-old to tackle that thing. Sometimes they fail. In some of our contests, even if you fail, you get the scholarship dollars, because what we're trying to teach is not only the resilience, but the idea that you can do this. You don't have to go to your state capital. You don't have to go to Washington, D.C. And you can actually make the kind of principled change at the local level without becoming despondent about the small d democratic project. We're a democratic republic, and that means that we have to be active. Skills building is something that is really important about civics. And yet we've told kids to go boil the ocean. And when the boiling of the ocean fails, what often happens is that they feel despondent about the whole thing. And then they look to solutions that are outside of kind of our American tradition. They reject in some ways those principles. And I think this is one way that we're taking a kind of practical step by working with teachers, by working directly with students, to change the way, to really almost invent a new category of civics that blends significant amount of knowledge along with engagement.
Well, we love engagement at Engage the Rockies. So I guess the question would be then, do you think that something like the Bill of Rights Institute is essentially a next iteration of a textbook? I mean, you talked about how long district teachers spend in textbooks versus charter schools versus whatever. Is the textbook bygone days? I mean, we could say that the same way about the Declaration of Independence being a written document, and yet today we do everything on video and audio.
It's a great question. I think that the savvy teacher knows that young people are oftentimes, so they ditch the textbook, the student does, right? Even if it's kind of on background. And they'll very often go to a podcast or a YouTube, kind of expert that says, let me cut to the chase and give you all the answers. And they'll listen, they'll watch, and they'll kind of rinse and repeat and just do that over and over again. That might be a tactic for getting a 5 on the AP US history exam, but it's not a very good way to build these and take these ideas and make them yours, make them internal. So I think a great teacher ditches the textbook for sure. We see ourselves as really displacing the typical old status quo way of doing civics, where you sit down and you kind of methodically go through and just memorize the things only to forget them the next day or week or month. The goal here is that you actually do learn a tremendous architecture of knowledge, though. You'll sometimes hear people that say, well, it's all in you can Google it. Well, you can't Google civic gratitude. You can't bring that into your heart and mind. You have to acquire it. And there's a lot of knowledge, to be historically conscious. You have to know not only what decade the Civil War was, but what was it for? What was it about? What was at stake? And young people can do that. They can do it at the elementary grades. They can soak up an enormous amount of information and knowledge. And the goal of education, after all, liberal, humane education, liberal as in the liberal arts, right? The arts of freedom, is to give you the knowledge that you need and to move you from knowledge to wisdom. Wisdom is rare. It's hard. It requires a kind of lifelong commitment. And so, in addition to replacing the textbook, what we're seeking to do is to equip the teacher, the guide in all of this, the person that can help a student unlock the potential that they have for not activism, because activism short circuits the learning process, right? It says to like a 5th grader or 6th grader, all right, you know enough, now go out and yell at people and, do all of the kind of things that really don't build the kind of learning paths and lifelong engagement. The peaceful right to protest is a constitutionally enshrined right. But getting young people to think that protesting or politicking your way out of a problem is the only solution is really folly. And so to round that out, I think what you're driving at, Sarah, which is so interesting, is you think about how does a young person, get the habit formation? Knowledge plus skills equals a dispositional change, habit formation. And what you're trying to do is say, it's not just enough to memorize. You have to go deep. You have to go to the why. You have to plumb the depths of these questions. And that kind of study takes a long while. And then the judicious application of skills, right? Think of what the scouts do at their best. You don't just learn about camping, you actually go do it. That's at the heart of the kind of Tocquevillian art of association. So what you're trying to habituate in young people is that it's good to be in your local community. It's good to be engaged in problem solving with your fellow citizens. And in doing that, you know what you gain? You gain the skill of managing disagreement. Because if you do any of that kind of work, you are going to disagree with the people, even that you find common cause with. And rather than seeking to eliminate it, because a lot of people think now, well, we just have to eliminate the opposition and we'll be just fine. You don't want to eliminate opposition or disagreement. You want to manage it. We're a nation of 340 million people. Huge. We're not going to eliminate our disagreement, but we do have to learn how to disagree better. And we think that that kind of civil discourse and the affirmation of free speech that comes with that is a really great lifelong kind of mindset to have.
Absolutely. So, moving a little aside from the Bill of Rights, you have, and I confess I haven't read it yet, but I put it in my Amazon cart. You've written a book. Tell me a little bit about that.
I wrote a book on humility, and it's a book that drew and kind of came from a question that has been with me since grad school days, and it's, can you be great and humble at the same time? And so it's really an exploration of America, wondering against the usual charge or common charge against our country, which is that we've been mainly a force for arrogance. If you take up that question, you look at the lives of some leaders. I looked at people like George Washington, Abigail Adams, Frederick Douglass, James Madison, people that we can very often stop and say, absolutely, they were great. But can we also say they were humble? And I'd argue that in this book that there are a few rare individuals where you can hold both of those traits together. How would you do it? Well, take, for example, George Washington. During the first 20 years of his life, I used to tell my students he would have been all over Instagram. He was vain. He was kind of rash. He was brash. He was kind of a braggart, right? He thought he was all that. And he was on an absolute fast track to fame. And he wanted it. The question is, do you want fame for the right purposes, though? So he wanted greatness. But what kind of put him on a path, I think, towards a lifelong determination that he could become humble, right? Because it's hard to achieve this and say, well, now I'm humble. I've really achieved it, right? I'm the best at humility. That's not the goal. The idea is that you keep on it. And so somebody like George Washington had to deal with a lot of setbacks and failure early on. After all, he touched off kind of a global war because he was rash, not courageous. That's a big deal. And I think what it chastened Washington to realize is that true greatness lies not in just running over other people, running over your country's ideals to get to greatness, but in putting yourself under the law, putting yourself in front of the people, right? And under the sway of the people, right? So that the electoral outcome determines whether you stay in office. And even if you might have the power like he did to assert himself and say, I might even like to be king, you turn away from that, make a different decision. And so was Washington perfect at humility? No. Was Abraham Lincoln or any of the other folks that I looked at? No, they weren't the paragon of humility, but they achieved enough of it, I think, to be pretty remarkable. And it was an essential part of their greatness.
Is there another sequel to that coming out?
Well, it's a question that continues to fascinate me. Lately, I've been taken with questions around what we just talked about, civics. And so I'm working on a book on the future of civics.
Brilliant. So in terms of what you mentioned there, are you in favor of term limits? Do you think that would be a solution? Again, we tend to look at things from this lens of going to Washington to fix something or going up to our state capitals to fix something. And yet you're asserting in our conversation that it's actually something within inside ourselves that needs to be corrected.
Yeah, I think if you know yourself first, right, and especially this is the project of both civics in school and out of school, you then can equip yourself, right? That's the gathering of those skills. And ultimately, then you're in a much better place to actually bring the kind of congruence to the principles of the Declaration. Calvin Coolidge, on the 100th anniversary of the Declaration, here we are next year going to be celebrating 250 years. But at the 150-year mark, he gave a great speech, and he said, these principles of all men are created equal, all human beings are created equal. That's a final statement, right? There's nothing more that can be added or nothing subtracted from that. The question then is, how do we put that into practice? Your question about term limits is an interesting one. I'll speak just for myself here. The Bill of Rights Institute doesn't take positions on these matters, but I personally don't think they're effective or the right idea. Because I think, for one, if you look at, especially for policymakers, for those in the legislative branch especially, I'll speak to that you can see ambition, and it's better to be able to reward properly channeled ambition with another term than to quell it too quickly. Also, in our current state of affairs, to term limit, say, members of the U.S. House of Representatives or the United States Senate would immediately give even more power to the kind of individuals that you find all across the city, that many of them do good work, the aides, right? The more than 10,000 staffers that are in person here in the nation's capital. My office is just across the river from Washington, D.C., in Arlington, Virginia. And I think that would be the same way for most legislative chambers across this country. Now, that being said, I think the 2-term limit that came about in the U.S. presidency is a good idea. I'd stick with that. And I think for governors, it's okay to have a cap on the number of terms. I live in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's the only state now that has one and done. And the problem with that is just about the time that you get going in the second year of a 1 4-year term, you're kind of a lame duck. And so it's not a very effective way to capture ambition and the rewards that can come for a job well done.
Well, one final question for you. This has been fascinating. In terms of Bill of Rights Institute and what you're doing, that doesn't necessarily or isn't as such or shouldn't be affected by a change in federal power. And since you're working with all 50 states, but do you see an influence thereof in terms of, we've obviously just had a change in regime. So then what does that look like for you guys in terms of the implications of the Bill of Rights Institute?
So the Bill of Rights Institute is supported philanthropically. We receive support from tens of thousands of individuals and foundations. And we determined from hard-won experience and also just thinking ahead to the kind of whiplash effect that often happens when the federal government gets involved in funding in our space, that we're not going to accept any federal dollars. So that's a stance we've had for a little more than a decade in the time that I've been with the organization. And I'll tell you, that means that we're insulated from the kind of things that have happened as of late. Take, for example, the last administration, the Biden administration, said that they wanted to look at all Department of Ed grants through the lens of equity. And they pointed in particular to the 1619 project as an example. Trump has said, no, we need to have a 1776 commission. And he's doing certain things this go around to revive that thing that he did in his first term. We think that there's danger in both, in that when the federal government gains control of what could amount to a kind of almost de facto curriculum, that what you end up with is a situation that ultimately makes people look again to Washington, D.C. for all of our cues. Do we really want an official history that changes with political party that comes into power? My favorite textbook title comes from the nation of South Korea, not North Korea, but South Korea. And a few years ago, they had a textbook called The Correct Textbook of History. And it was done in the fashion of the political party having gained power. They just said, you know what, we're going to rewrite the nation's curriculum. And that became the correct textbook of history. And if we're not careful, I think we're headed towards that direction. So what we've done is encourage our fellow nonprofits, and for that matter, for-profit entities around the country, to not take their bearings from Washington, D.C., but actually serving teachers, parents, and young people who actually need the real support that we're able to provide them.
That's brilliant, David. I'm just excited. So where could people find the Bill of Rights Institute, and how do they connect with your resources?
So mybri.org, online, you'll find 6,000 resources. You'll find information too. We didn't talk much about professional learning for educators, But if you lead a school, you're a teacher yourself, or you're just otherwise interested as a homeschooling parent in learning more, we offer webinars. You can find us on YouTube, and mybri.org is the best one-stop shop for everything you need in history and civics.
Thank you so much for your time. I learned so much and really appreciated it.
So much, Sarah Jane.
Thank you for listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.